What exactly do you think you're entitled to here? Chloe asked, her smile never quite reaching her eyes. We were standing in the sun-drenched lobby of a high-end resort in Cape Cod. My son, Julian, was staring down at his expensive leather loafers as if they were the most fascinating thing in the room. I had just found out that no room had been booked for me. This was despite the weeks of planning, and despite the fact that I'd already shelled out $500 to cover the gas and snacks for the entire road trip. My name is Martha. I'm 70 and I've been a widow for 5 years. I live in a sturdy brick house in a quiet suburb of Philadelphia. I'm not a woman of many words, but I don't miss a thing. Over the last few months, Chloe, Julian's wife, had been slowly taking over. It started with little digs about my clothes, then moved on to critiques of my cooking. But today was the breaking point. The hotel is totally booked up, Martha. Chloe continued smoothing a stray hair back into her perfect blowout. We figured you could just find a spot at that little motel 2 blocks down. I mean, it's just for sleeping, right? Julian cleared his throat, but didn't say a word. He'd always been the type to duck for cover at the first sign of conflict, even if it meant letting his own mother stand out in the rain. I didn't feel angry, just a deep, bone-chilling clarity. In my head, things began to shift. I watched Chloe as she started wheeling her suitcase toward the elevator, acting like the matter was settled. She expected me to just fall in line, to grab my bags and shuffle off to some budget motel, only to show up bright and early tomorrow to babysit the grandkids. I see, I said quietly. My voice was steady, no trembling, no tears. I gripped the handle of my small leather carry-on. Chloe turned back, a triumphant glint in her eyes. But my next sentence extinguished that spark instantly. In that case, I'm headed home. The silence that followed was heavy. Julian finally looked up, pure shock written all over his face. What do you mean, headed home? Julian stammered. He took a step toward me, but I held up a hand to keep him at bay. It wasn't a dramatic moment, no shouting, just a very clear boundary. Chloe let out a sharp, nervous laugh. Don't be so dramatic, Martha. We were just trying to save some money. You're always saying you don't need luxury. I looked her straight in the eye. It's not about luxury, Chloe. It's about respect. And it seems like you left yours at the check-in desk. Without another word, I turned around. I could feel their eyes burning into my back. Normally, I would have tried to smooth things over or made excuses for them. Not today. The years I'd spent helping Julian out financially flashed through my mind like a movie. I walked out into the fresh, salt air. The parking lot was packed, but my car was parked right near the exit. I stowed my bag in the trunk of my reliable Buick. In my purse, I felt the weight of my house keys. Chloe had been pestering me for weeks to give her a spare set for emergencies. I was so glad I'd stood my ground. As I started the engine, my phone started buzzing in the center console. It was Julian. I ignored it. I didn't head for the motel. I hopped right onto the interstate heading back toward Philly. The 4-hour drive gave me plenty of time to think. Chloe thought she held all the cards because she was young and demanding. She forgot who poured the foundation she built her house of cards on. When I pulled into my driveway, my house felt like a fortress for the first time in ages. I locked the deadbolt and slid the chain home. Then I sat in my kitchen and made a cup of tea. My eyes drifted to the laptop on the counter, specifically to the $1,200 monthly automatic transfer I sent to Julian to help cover his overpriced mortgage. With a few clicks, the payment for the first of the month was gone. The next morning, I woke up without that usual heavy sense of obligation. Normally, I'd be at the hotel wrangling the kids for breakfast while Chloe slept in. Instead, I enjoyed the quiet of my own backyard. The The birds were out, and my neighbor waved over the fence. It was a peaceful Tuesday morning, but I knew the storm was coming. Around 11 a.m., the calls started. First Julian, then Chloe, then Julian again. I left the phone on the sideboard. I have a simple rule: if you treat me with disrespect, you lose the right to my time. I didn't check the messages until the 10th one popped up. Mom, what is going on? The hotel just called your credit card for the incidental deposit was canceled. We have to pay the whole thing ourselves now. I almost smiled. I had put down the deposit for the entire block of rooms when we planned this months ago. Since I was no longer part of the vacation, there was no reason for my card to be used as security. A quick call to the bank the night before had handled it. It wasn't revenge. It was just a logical consequence of me not being there. A text from Chloe followed shortly after. You're being so childish. We're stuck here and you're making a scene over a room. Julian is devastated. How can you do this to your grandkids? The emotional blackmail didn't work anymore. I knew the pattern. When she didn't get her way, she used the kids as a human shield. But the kids were fine. They were with their father, they had food, and they had a roof over their heads. I spent the afternoon oiling the hinges on my patio door. It was the little things that reminded me I was in control. I wasn't some lonely old woman waiting for a phone call. I was the owner of this house, the woman with the savings account, and the one who decided who sat at my table. My next step, reviewing the power of attorney I'd given Julian years ago for emergencies. Better safe than sorry. 2 days later, I heard a car pull into the driveway. It was my son's SUV. They were back early. I watched through the curtains as Chloe hopped out looking furious, while Julian ushered the kids inside to their iPads. This wasn't a visit. It was an ambush. I took a deep breath, straightened my cardigan, and opened the door before they could even ring the bell. Martha, what was that? Chloe practically screamed before she even crossed the threshold. We had to cut our trip short. The costs were astronomical, and all because you're on some ego trip. I stepped back to let them in, but stayed standing in the hallway. I didn't offer coffee, and I didn't offer a seat on the sofa. That was my first boundary. It wasn't an ego trip, Chloe, I said calmly. You made it clear that I'm just a line item in your budget and a free nanny. A service provider can cancel their services at any time. Julian looked exhausted. Mom, the room thing was just a misunderstanding. We just wanted to… I cut him off. You stood there and watched Julian. That wasn't a misunderstanding, it was a choice. And I've made mine. Chloe scoffed. And what about the money? Why did you stop the mortgage transfer? We were counting on that for the house payment. She was getting louder, her eyes flashing with greed. In that moment, I saw her more clearly than ever. She didn't love my son. She loved the lifestyle I provided. And Julian was too weak to see the difference. I crossed my arms. That money was a gift, not a contract. Since I clearly need more money for my own travel and security, considering I have to book my own hotel rooms, now that money is no longer available. Chloe went pale. It finally hit her that the $1,200 a month wasn't coming back. The house went very quiet. The next few weeks were defined by a strange distance. Julian would drop by occasionally, usually alone. He tried to apologize, but it sounded hollow. He didn't ask how I was doing. He asked how long I was going to keep up this phase. He still didn't get that this wasn't a phase, it was my new life. I remained polite, but firm. Chloe, on the other hand, tried a new tactic, the cold shoulder. She stopped sending photos of the grandkids and ignored my birthday texts. It was a classic attempt to isolate me, hoping I'd come crawling back for forgiveness. But she underestimated one thing: over the last few years, I'd built a circle of friends outside the family. I wasn't alone. One afternoon, Julian showed up again. He looked disheveled. Chloe is giving me hell, Mom. Without your help, we're going to have to sell the place, or I'll have to take a second job. Can't you at least send half? He sounded like a little boy begging for an allowance. It hurt my heart to see him like that, but pity is a terrible reason to enable someone. Julian, I said, placing a hand on his arm. You're a grown man with a good career. If your lifestyle is only possible because of your mother's social security and savings, you're living beyond your means. That's not on me. I saw him swallow hard. He'd hoped I'd cave if he looked sad enough. But I'd learned that true love sometimes means letting someone feel the weight of their own choices. Before he left, I handed him an envelope. He probably hoped for a check, but it was just the legal paperwork revoking his access to my bank accounts. I want everything to be clear, I said. My money belongs to me. What I do with it is my decision. And I've decided to invest in my own future. He left without another word. To my surprise, I got an invitation from Chloe in November. A family dinner to clear the air. The card read. Not a word of apology, but an olive branch or so, I thought. I knew she had something up her sleeve. Chloe wasn't the type to just give in. But I accepted. I wanted to see how far they would go. When I walked into their place that evening, the vibe was fake friendly. The table was set and it smelled like a pot roast. But the first thing I noticed were the moving boxes stacked in the corner of the hallway. Chloe caught me looking. Oh, that's nothing, she said quickly. Just a little reorganizing. We sat down and the conversation was agonizingly forced. After the main course, she got to the point. Martha, we've been thinking. This house of yours is way too big for one person. The yard work, the property taxes. It's a burden. We were thinking we should all move in together. We sell this condo and your house and buy a big multi-generational place. We could support each other. I put my fork down. It was so predictable. They didn't want me. They wanted the equity in my house to plug their financial holes. Julian looked at me, expectantly, hope in his eyes. He actually thought this was the solution to all his problems. He couldn't see that in this scenario, I'd be demoted to an unpaid housekeeper and a human ATM. That's an interesting idea, I said, taking a sip of water. Chloe was already smiling triumphantly. She thought she had me. But I've actually already made other plans for the house. The smile on her face froze. What plans? Julian asked, sounding irritated. I waited a beat, enjoying the sudden tension. It was time to lay my cards on the table. I've decided not to sell the house. I began calmly. But I'm also not going to be living there alone anymore. Chloe leaned forward. See? So we are moving in. I shook my head. No. I've reached out to a local nonprofit that helps single mothers find housing. I'm converting the upstairs, which is empty anyway, into a separate apartment to rent out. The look of horror on Chloe's face was almost funny. You're letting strangers into your house, into our inheritance, she blurted out. There it was, the naked greed. She already viewed my property as hers. Julian just sat there, his mouth slightly open. The idea that I was actively shaping my own life without asking them seemed to blow his mind. It's my house, Chloe, not your inheritance, at least not for a long, long time, I said, with a sharpness that made her flinch. The rental income will pad my retirement so I can afford any hotel room I want in the future, without relying on the mercy of my family. Chloe jumped up. You can't do that. We need the money from a house sale to pay off our debts. Finally, the truth was out. Debt. They had completely buried themselves trying to keep up appearances. They'd probably been shuffling credit card balances and praying the old lady would either give in or pass away. Julian put his face in his hands. It's true, Mom. We're underwater. If you don't help us, we lose everything. I looked at my son. It ached, but I stayed firm. You won't lose everything, Julian. You'll just lose the image you've been struggling to maintain. You both have jobs. Move to a smaller apartment, sell the SUV. Learn to stand on your own 2 feet. That's the only help I'm offering you, the cold, hard reality. Chloe started crying, but they weren't tears of regret. They were tears of rage. After that dinner, there was radio silence. But this time, it was a silence I dictated. I started the renovations on the top floor. Contractors were in and out, and the house felt full of life even before anyone moved in. I felt more energized than I had in years. Claiming my finances and my space had set me free. One day, Chloe showed up in my garden unannounced. She looked different, less polished, almost desperate. Martha, please. Julian is depressed. He's barely sleeping. Can we at least talk about a loan? We'll sign whatever you want. She was trying the pity play now, but I knew any money I gave them would just disappear into a black hole. No, Chloe, I said, pruning my roses. I didn't even look up. No loans. I'm not a bank. I offered to help Julian set up a budget, but he refused. He wants the quick fix, not the right one. Chloe muttered a curse under her breath and called me a heartless old witch. I just smiled. If being heartless means refusing to be exploited, I'll wear that title proudly. Shortly after, my new tenants moved in a young woman and her little daughter. The house was suddenly filled with laughter and life. Little Mia reminded me of my own grandkids, but without the pressure Chloe always applied. I realized how good it felt to be needed in a healthy, boundaried way. I wasn't a backup plan anymore. I was a landlord and a mentor. Julian called me eventually to tell me they'd sold the condo and moved into a rental on the outskirts of town. He sounded sad, but also a little relieved. The pressure to be something he wasn't seemed to be lifting. For the first time in months, he asked, "How are you doing, Mom?" That moment was worth more than every cent I'd ever saved. Time passed and winter set in. My house was warm, the rent was on time, and I had more time for my own hobbies. I'd signed up for a pottery class and went hiking twice a week. My life was no longer built around Julian and Chloe's needs. I was my own center. For Christmas, I suggested we all have dinner at my place on my terms. Everyone brings a dish, we share the work, and we don't talk about money, I said over the phone. Chloe was against it at first, but Julian finally stood his ground. They came over on Christmas Eve and it was different. It was humbler, but more real. Chloe was uncharacteristically quiet. She looked around my house, seeing how parts of it now belonged to others, and seemed to realize she'd lost her leverage for good. I had shifted the power dynamic not through fighting, but through facts. When she tried to make a snide comment about the tenants, I simply ignored it and passed her the roast. I gave her nothing to hook into. The grandkids played with Mia in the living room. It was a picture of normalcy I hadn't thought possible. Julian helped me with the dishes. "You know, Mom," he said quietly. "I was really mad at you at first, but now that we have less, Chloe and I aren't fighting as much over status stuff. It's quieter." I dried a plate and looked at him. "Peace is something you have to earn, Julian, mostly by being honest with yourself." He nodded. He still has a long way to go to shake off Chloe's dominance and his own passivity, but the first step is taken. And me, I wasn't the woman they couldn't find a room for anymore. I was the woman who owned the whole house. It's been a year since that incident in Cape Cod. When I think back on it now, I don't feel pain, only gratitude. Chloe's insulting question, "What do you think you're entitled to?" was exactly the wake-up call I needed. She thought she could make me feel small, but she only reminded me of how much power I actually had. My grandkids spend many weekends with me now. Chloe stays in the background. She's learned that my door stays locked if she tries to take her moods out on me. We have a functional relationship, not warm, but respectful. And that's plenty for me. I don't need fake harmony. I prefer honest distance. My financial advisor is happy my tenants have become a little surrogate family, and my garden is blooming better than ever. I've learned that getting older doesn't mean you get pushed aside unless you let it happen. You have to be willing to pack your bags and walk away if your seat at the table isn't set with respect. That's where the real power lies. Some evenings I sit on my porch and look up at the stars. I think about Julian and hope he keeps finding his way. But I also know I'm not carrying his load anymore. My strength belongs to me, my house, my rules, my life. I recently got a postcard from Julian that said, "Thanks for being so tough on us." I knew then that I'd done the right thing. He's starting to live his own life, and I've finally gotten mine back. That old, scuffed suitcase from the trip is still in the basement. A reminder that sometimes the most important trip you'll ever take is the one you take alone just to find yourself again. Sometimes walking away in silence isn't losing. It's showing others that you were never meant for the small space they tried to force you into.